I see a lot of familiar names and faces. Hi. And gosh, I worked with a lot of you. I hired some of you. This is really cool. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself for the 2 or 3 of you who don't know who I am, apparently. My name is Matt Fleming. I've been with Salinas Union High School District since about 2009. I've been an administrator in the district for about a decade, and I've had some years in administration prior to coming here. Been an assistant principal at the middle and high school levels. I've been a principal at the elementary, middle, and high school level. Taught mostly English, although I am old enough that I started teaching before No Child Left Behind, and a school of about 600 or 700 students up in the mountains. So I ended up teaching, let's see, I taught some math. I taught some remediation in math. I taught PE for a couple years. I've taught band, all of that, history, social studies, but mostly English, poetry, all that kind of stuff. And I also was an ELD teacher for a number of years. And right now, one of the reasons that a year ago this next week, it was actually next week, a week from today, 1 year ago, I called Mr. Burns, our superintendent, and said, I'd really like to go back to the classroom this year. And we made that happen. And I have been, I started working, it'll be 3 years next month. I started working on a PhD in psychology, focusing on cognition and instruction, cognitive psychology and learning, basically. And the subject of this presentation is basically related to the topic that I started researching, which I ran into issues with Institutional Review Board. And anybody who's done graduate research knows that they don't like novice researchers doing things that you could run into ethical issues. And so my original topic, I was looking at trauma, childhood trauma, and I was looking at our English language development scores, our SELT test scores, and our LPAC scores. And I thought I saw some trends there, but I was going to need to do some pretty deep research on it, and they didn't want to allow that. And also, I was working with LA Unified, and they were at first really jazzed about this. Then they talked to legal, and they didn't like the idea of this because they realized if we did discover a correlation between childhood trauma and delays or stagnation in language development, that there would be a problem with us because we could end up having a responsibility to these kids legally. So it's going to be something that I'm going to have to wait. I still have some people that are interested in doing this down the road. Once I have those precious letters after my name, hopefully before Christmas, that'll be nice. I'm closing in on that thing, but this is all stuff that I've been working on. So some of you have worked with me. I see Estella there. She knows that I geek out on stuff like this quite a bit. And so this presentation, knowing that it's late in the afternoon, I want to make this one kind of easy on you. It's only going to be an hour. We're going to be spending some time getting some information on kind of the background of how childhood trauma presents in education, some of the problems and things that we deal with. And then we're going to look at how that interacts with language development, language production, learning how to speak, read, write, listen. And then we're going to move into some basic ideas and concepts around how you can use this information to tackle these issues that your students have. Because in our district, as we've said for years, all of us are English language development teachers, right? We all have, no matter what our content area is, no matter what our area of responsibility is, we are, always going to have responsibility for teaching kids about English and English language development. And this is one of those things that no matter what level of interaction I'm having. It seems like I always come back to this idea that, yeah, we teach content, but we really have to remember we're teaching kids, and their needs, the barriers that exist to their learning are things that we have to address. And that's basically how I came upon this as a research area that I will continue to follow for some time. All right, so the links are all there. Make sure you sign in, because I don't want anybody to not get paid. That'd be bad. So again, here's the information. I posted this in the chat. If you haven't gotten the link to the presentation, you can just use that QR code right there on the screen. And again, like I said, I'm trying to make this a very low demand session. I'm not gonna, this isn't like my 2-hour session yesterday where I'm gonna ask you to do Padlets and all different kinds of stuff like that, because I know it's late in the day. All right, so here's basically our agenda of how this will go. We're going to look into this crisis, developmental trauma. We're going to look into how it connects and impacts learning, and then how we can remove some of these barriers, and then we'll discuss some things that you might be able to take back to your classroom when you meet your students in 13 days. All right, so this is our problem. Now, adverse childhood experiences. I will be using that phrase a lot. Adverse childhood experiences, it's an academic term, but it refers to the original study, which we'll talk about in a, sorry about that, Nick. We'll be talking about this in, as we go through this. ACEs is a term that refers to childhood trauma, essentially. All right. Now, there's some terms that are kind of interchangeable almost in the literature. I see developmental trauma, I see complex trauma, and I see ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, childhood trauma. They all have different terms. And part of that, I think, has to do with the review process that research goes through. When you start writing for publication or for academic purposes, you've got reviewers and committee members who tell you what they think, and sometimes they have to give you some feedback, and so they often do spend a lot of time on little key terms and what they mean and what you mean and what they think you mean and what they want you to mean, and it goes around a lot. The other thing is, I mentioned institutional review boards. Anytime you mention children and trauma, you look forward to another 6 months of them looking at your study with a fine-tooth comb. I kind of tend to think the term adverse childhood experiences, it's kind of a way to make the IRB feel better. It doesn't sound as bad as childhood trauma. But our first study about this was done by a guy named Felitti. He's a medical doctor, PhD, and he works for the Kaiser Permanente Foundation. He is a doctor and researcher that works with Kaiser. And this study, eventually, I think the original one used 12,000 students, 14,000 children, something like that. Actually, it was adults that they were looking back on. And it went on, and I think they've gotten it up to well over 50,000 people as part of this study. It was originally published in 1998. And this study was originally done because doctors were noticing some trends. Children who were presenting with obesity had certain experiences that they had gone through related to different types of abuse and different types of neglect or household dysfunction that they were experiencing as they were growing up in their families of origin. And as a result, they were presenting with certain health problems. And we now know from this original study and many dozens that have gone on after it, and it's an exploding research area. I have research alerts through, Web of Science and the APA and several others. I get 3 to 5 new articles a week. Some of them are pre-publication that are about to be published. This is a huge area of research right now. Another reason I'm rushing to get my dissertation done is I don't want somebody to step on it and publish first. But the idea of what we found is when a child goes through something like, could be verbal abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, could be neglect, hunger, poverty, whatever it is, could be a household dysfunction like a parent is absent, incarcerated, those type of things. Maybe there's, divorce and separation going on, whatever it is. These taken together can be predictive of a lot of different problems. They're so strongly correlated that they can be used to predict the likelihood of a child developing these health problems later on in life. It is literally a high score on the ACEs assessment, which is a 10-point survey. And you may have taken it if you have children that go to a pediatrician. For the last 4 or 5 years, our former state surgeon general has recommended that all pediatricians screen patients for ACEs. It's a 10-point yes or no survey that people take. And if you score with 4 yeses or higher, you have a significant dosage of trauma in your life. If you score 4 or higher, you have a greater likelihood of premature death. And it's not just a little, it's like 12 years less on average, your lifespan impacted. It predicts for obesity, diabetes, all kinds of cardiovascular disease, some types of cancer, various stress-related injuries or illnesses, neurological issues. This led to some later research, and you may recognize the name van der Kolk. Bessel van der Kolk is another MD, PhD. He was working here in USF for a while. He's now, I think he's in Boston. I got to ask him some questions on a virtual conference once. Not the most approachable dude in the world. He's a very serious researcher, but he began researching with Vietnam vets in the 70s, looking at what happens to them related to trauma. And you've probably heard all kinds of things about PTSD, CPTSD, and how that affects folks. And he began publishing, and his primary works related to ACEs came out in 2003, 2004, and 2014. And you've probably heard of his book. Some of you who are into this may have heard of The Body Keeps the Score. It's a very popular book right now, very approachable read, but a lot of good science in it. And what he discovered is this link between neurological development, physiological development, and early trauma exposure. He's actually trying to get something called developmental trauma disorder. I put an asterisk there because he attempted to get it into the DSM, which is the manual that therapists use to classify diagnoses of different behavioral and emotional disorders, psychological disorders. He wanted developmental trauma disorder to be a part of that. It was narrowly kicked back by the committee this last time about a year ago. He's currently working on addressing their comments to present that again and have it added. He also calls it polyvagal theory. Those of you, I got some biology teachers in here. Jen, I see you there. He's talking about the vagal nerve networks in the body. So because this network, he calls it polyvagal because it branches throughout the body. And what he's discovered, along with a lot of other researchers, is that this network is connected to everything. And it's not just, as we sometimes are taught to think about our nervous system, like transmits, certain signals for bodily function or for, feeling and sensory information. There's a lot more that goes on with this. It's much deeper and richer than that. It turns out that as you experience early childhood trauma, it actually affects the way this network develops. It may explain why. We also know that polyvagal theory is involved in those of us who have experienced a severe trauma as adults and maybe get acute stress disorders or something like post-traumatic stress disorder, because it actively changes the way our body responds to threat. The idea behind what we usually call the flight or fight response. My instructors in universities were always 3 F's, flight, fight, or make friends. When we experience another organism, another organism, any organism will have a response to that other organism. Is it something that, I'm going to interact with, have some kind of collaboration with? Is there going to be mating taking place? Is it going to eat me? Do I have to run away? Or do I kill and eat it? Or however you respond to it. And that's the root of our own flight, fight response. So when a child has trauma, it's a little different than an adult. Even adults can be so scared that they're almost scared into paralysis and they can't do anything. And sometimes our fear response leads to an altered state. And when it becomes something chronic and long-term like PTSD, it's actually changed the way our brain responds. If you have somebody who's having what we would traditionally think of as a flashback, like think of the traditional combat veteran, stereotypical idea of a combat veteran having a flashback and reliving a traumatic event in combat. What's happening is their brain is not processing the event as if it is a past event. That's why a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy dealing with grief and trauma focuses on teaching yourself to vision this event in the past as no longer affecting you. When I go in as a chaplain or a crisis counselor, I try to assure people that the worst part is over. You're going to be okay. It's over now, because they need to hear that. Their body is telling them there's still a threat. And if that gets ingrained deep enough, causes changes in the amygdala, causes changes in the way our brain functions. In a child, those changes become ingrained in the development of their entire body. So it impacts almost everything that they do. So what does it all mean? I know this is a long bullet list. I promise this is the densest slide I have. But the brain doesn't really work the way you and I are probably taught. A lot of times we think about brain centers, where some function is centered in the brain. It's to be clear, there are areas that are important in brain function, but it doesn't really work the way we think of. A lot of people, we've heard about stories of, how we learned a lot about the brain because of observing before and after events with individuals who went through brain trauma or disease, and we could see how it changed them and their cognition and their personality. But as teachers of English learners, we need to think about some specific things. Yes, we have certain areas of the brain which are very important to producing and understanding speech. So for example, think of the visual cortex in the back of the brain. That's back in what we'd call the occipital lobe. It's in the back and kind of above the brainstem. And, that's very important to vision. That's connected to a lot of areas related to recognizing text, recognizing written words, okay? Then it's a whole mess of stuff on the left side of our brain, going from basically this temporal lobe, which is right kind of behind our ear and the back of our jaw. And that's going to have something called the Wernicke's area. You're going to have the auditory cortex. And the Wernicke's area is just involved in understanding speech. And it makes sense. It's right back by the ear. And then we have in this prefrontal cortex, which is the lower part of the front, you're going to have this Broca's area, which is involved in speech production. And that sounds weird to have it up here in speech and sight recognition back away from the eyes. But that's because the motor cortex is kind of this middle area. And so a lot of muscular control and volitional control of our nervous system is involved in producing speech. So your students can not only, maybe they're English learners, but if anything has happened to disrupt function in any of these areas or their connection to some other important area, it's going to cause increased delays. The other thing that's going on is childhood trauma takes place a lot of times right in these sensitive periods that are perfect for children to learn how to produce speech and to understand speech and language. You may know from meeting some of your students that if they are raised in a truly bilingual home where, let's say, they're learning Spanish and English concurrently from birth, they're going to be functionally bilingual the rest of their lives. And they're also going to have a proclivity for languages. They tend to have that because these areas are hyper developed. But more than that, we're founding is we've got something we call parallel dispersed networks in the brain. Neurons connect with each other. The more they connect with other areas of the brain, the more active they're going to be, the more easy it is to retrieve information from them and to process it quickly. The more we use those, the stronger the synapses get. There's actually a term called synaptic strength and synaptic weight. And this relates to how quickly and how strong and robust those connections are. So think about the way a lot of us learned our second and third languages. We learned them in college or in high school, right? Some of you may have learned Spanish in high school, but how much conversational Spanish did you keep? When you look back on that, in some cases, maybe you're like me, where it's easy for you to remember. If you read Spanish, you can understand it. But if you try to produce it, it's much harder. Like if you try to speak it, you're using different parts of the brain. And it can reflect on how you were taught the language. So, for example, as an adult, 30 years old, I learned Greek and Hebrew for graduate school, ancient Greek and ancient Hebrew. I can read and write them. I can understand them in written form, but I do not understand them spoken because that was not how I was taught. It was not a conversational language. So I didn't create synaptic and neural connections to the Broca's area, the Wernicke's area, auditory cortex, things like that. It's all back in the visual cortex. Okay, so that's something that our students are going to be fighting. So the other thing that happens is memories are very malleable. It's very easy for us, every time we retrieve a memory and interact with that in some way again, for it to be altered slightly by perceptions of certain things. Okay, if you've ever had conflict in your family over something that happened 30, 40 years ago, you know what I'm talking about. People remember things differently. Okay, trauma makes this worse. Trauma disrupts the normal pattern of storing memories for retrieval. Absolutely everything, if your brain structure is intact, absolutely everything you've ever experienced is still there. But you are not going to be able to retrieve most of it because you have no retrieval cue for it. And that is why when we're learning something, when we talk about see, say, do techniques and strategies, when we talk about pair shares, when we talk about having students teach something or present something, they are creating more cues for retrieval of that information. And basically, the more a neuron is used in concert with another one, the stronger that connections get. So the other thing that happens is that we learn how to behave in context of our situation, that whatever we're in. And when we are learning how to behave in school, especially in middle and high school, we have different teachers every hour or so with different expectations. We pay attention to our social cues, to the things that the teachers are telling us, that other students are showing us. The problem is with a traumatized brain, it's harder to adapt and pay attention to those cues. And it is much harder for us to know when to act a certain way or adapt. So when a student does something surprising or unusual and you say, why did you do that? They will say, I don't know. And for the first time in my life, after researching this stuff, I believe them. All of this creates huge problems for English learners. I'm good. Yeah, okay. Somebody can message Jen, tell them I'm good. All right. So This number right here. This is not everything, but this is our student body, our student population. This is minority students from minority cultures, and roughly 12% are going to have a high trauma dosage. So when you look at this number, that's 4 out of 10 ACEs. So if they take the ACEs survey, which if you go back and look at my other presentation, which is on the SCED, or I can share it with somebody later if they want, it has a link to the ACEs survey. Did anyone in your family of origin ever physically harm you? Were you belittled, put down, verbally abused? Were you sexually abused? Were you trafficked? Were you, did you ever, growing up, did you have enough food? All these questions. Our students are going to have 4 more of those. And because they are children, some of them may be having ongoing trauma. So when you think about these, one of the cues that you have about these students is that they don't want to go home on Friday. They start to act up Friday afternoon. They start to act up the week before break or before the end of the school year. Okay? And because of that, it's because they don't want to go back to the place where they're being re-traumatized all the time. That's a tough thing. We don't usually think in terms of that. Now, I want to stop for a moment and just mention something. I know, because with that percentage, with the number of people on this call right now, there's 55 of you or so. I think we had 70 sign up, but there's 55 of you here right now. That means there's a significant number of you that have experienced trauma as a child. And I want to encourage you in some things. There is good news about this, which I'll mention in a moment. Mitigating this is relatively simple, and this is where you come in as a teacher. You can redeem this. And one of the things that is very important is that you talk to somebody. As an adult, sometimes we don't think that mental health services are a good idea. I believe it's very important that you do this. If you can reach out to me, I can help you find somebody that's good at this type of thing. But we also have our health insurance through the district, which is very good. Okay. All right, so now I want you to stop and think about something for a minute before we move on. Knowing what I've told you about our students, stop and think back to your former students that you've had in years past. Think about developmental trauma, symptoms and things that come up, these difficulties behaving, difficulty holding on to learning, difficulty accessing things later on, avoidance behaviors of home or other things that seem, sometimes they may be trying to please you. Think about those students that maybe fit this developmental trauma model. And I want you to think to yourself here, what challenges did they face compared to the other students in the class? And did they ultimately succeed? While you're thinking about that, I'll just illustrate a little bit, because I've got them on both sides of this spectrum. I have students who succeeded, and I had students who didn't. When I look back on my experience as a teacher early on, I have some experiences early on that I'm kind of ashamed of, because I tended to judge these students a little too harshly, I think. I looked at their inability to learn sometimes as a willful thing, their behavior issues as a willful thing. And realized now, anytime I got to the end of my rope with a student, I'm talking the first 3 years or so as a teacher, I always kind of found out shortly thereafter what was going on, what their story was. I found out that they had an alcoholic father that was beating them all the time. I found out that there were things happening that they were never going to be able to get past. And so I started thinking about what I felt was important in the classroom as opposed to what was really important in the classroom. So just think about those kind of kids. If anybody wants to put a question or something or comment in the chat, please do. And, I'm thinking about students myself that have been through an awful lot. I had a recent student who we were able to graduate him from Mount Toro under the assembly bill that allows us to let them have fewer credits. We gave him a lot of help. He was 19 when he finally walked. Both mom and dad died from COVID, and he was raising 3 siblings. Now, when this happened, he was still under 18. So just that event right there gave him a significant trauma. If anything happened earlier on, it probably did. He had a real tough time recalling information from class. You ask him about life before the last 6 months, and he couldn't remember much. Okay. So that's the problem. So here's the good news. The newer research is focusing a lot on resilience, okay? What we call positive childhood experiences or positive and compensatory experiences, because PACES rhymes with ACEs, and so they use that acronym. But the idea is that positive experiences in school can compensate for a lot of this. You really can be an instrument of change and healing for your students. And I just use this little acronym here for how we can help our learners remove some of these barriers. And so some of these are going to sound pretty familiar with you if you've had your GRR and CM training. So if you've taken a first aid class, you remember ABC, airway, breathing, circulation. You check to see if they're breathing. You check to see if their airway's open. You see if they're breathing. You check and see if they're bleeding. And you address those things first. Well, it's kind of the same with students that are exposed to trauma. You got to make your classroom safe for them. And what's hard for some people is dealing with the things you want for your classroom, the way you want students to behave, and the way these students really are. I gave up trying to make sure that every student had a pencil or pen a long time ago. I would put it down as an expectation. We would talk about that, but I had something so I could very quickly and quietly, unobtrusively, almost, invisibly take care of their need to participate. Okay? I was going to remove barriers to access. And this is what I'm talking about. And you've probably got some of these tools already. Access is more than just being able to do it, but it's getting them interested. So, but the key is to make them feel like it's safe and worthwhile to be there. If they're worried about where their next meal is coming from, how they're going to, keep a roof over their head, you have some pretty stiff competition for getting and keeping their attention. Think about you as a teacher. And, those of you who've worked with me know that I've worked through teachers with some really rough times in their life. Stuff happens to us. We lose loved ones. We go through serious illness, health scares, relationships, marriages, things happen. So pay attention to your students' interests and abilities. You really have to assess them and know what's going on. I usually start with some ways to get to know my class while I'm doing the introductory stuff the first couple of weeks while we're waiting for the schedule to settle down and for the circulation of students in this period and that period, and all the moving around that happens in our first couple weeks. And then I know where they are at and where they're coming from. And the big thing with learning English, I know that we have the curriculum guidelines and the pacing guides. And I know that we have this expectation from the district and the state that they become fluent no matter where they are in 2 years or less. I get it. But you got to go slow to go fast. You cannot force them to do too much too soon. That's going to put them under stress. And if you activate their stress, they're going to shut down. So be no demand, especially at the beginning, till you really know what they can do. Slow, easy stuff at first. Get them some quick success. Make a big deal specifically about what they're doing well. Celebrate it and do everything you can to convince the students that they are successful and good and smart and they can do it. Because most cases, their traumatized brain and nervous system is telling them that they suck, that they're a loser, that they can't compete. And here's another little thing. I don't like to talk about this much. Being a white cisgendered male, I understand my perspective on things, but I'm going to say this. There's research out there that certain populations, when they are faced with discrimination of some type, they internalize it. One of those populations is our Latino males. They are a population that, according to most research that's out there that's coming out now they are under researched, I will say that. And I think that's because we used to talk about Hispanics, Latino, Latinx. It's not a monolithic culture. And so it's hard to research. Okay? East Coast, West Coast, big difference in, nations of origin and things like that. So it's hard for researchers to do this. So it's understudied. But these students, our African American males and our Latino males, are more likely to internalize and believe negative things stereotypically about themselves, unless somebody is reinforcing to them that those things are not true and not accurate. And that's why we need to really work on that. I saw that, and it was a jaw-dropping thing when I read those two studies, because it hurts. And when you realize, there are other minority populations that totally reject this. There's some cultural difference that for some reason, the family structure and the dynamic confronts that and says, no, this is BS. I'm not going to believe that. I'm not going to own it. But there are cultures where it sinks in. And it's not their fault. I want to illustrate that as well. It is not their fault. It just simply is something that we can observe. So we have to counter that. Background knowledge. You've been told to activate prior knowledge, but you also want to do this from a cultural standpoint and celebrating who and what they are. Celebrate the value of their culture and individuality. One of the things that most of us here know is how diversity makes a local culture so rich and so strong and resilient. When it's monolithic, it's not. It weakens everything. We know this from a biological standpoint. Diversity in a genome creates resilience. It's true socially as well. But we just have to accept that. And we can't, it's very hard to get through that to some people. But make who and what they are something worth celebrating. And a lot of you do this already. I see that with what you do in your classrooms. And the point of that is they should never feel ashamed of the fact that they're not fluent in English yet. They don't grasp the host language as well as their L1, right? That L1 has value. They have value. It's something precious and essentially sacred that ties them to who they are, to their ancestors, to everything. And this is something that should be celebrated. make a big deal about who they are. Focus on what they know and what they can contribute. And those of you who have taught language much, errors are so often sign of progress in learning a language. Pronunciation errors, syntactical errors that show errors in syntax. Spanish teachers know this when they're teaching, non-Spanish speakers to speak Spanish as a second language. Those mistakes are sometimes a sign that they are so close. We've got to encourage them how to be willing to take those risks, making it safe. And tell them, oh my gosh, this is great. You know what you just said? It's not the right way to say it exactly, but that means that you're almost there. That it's something to make a big deal about. And the final thing relates to that, and it's comfort. This is really about safety. If they don't feel safe with you and safe in your classroom, taking risks is going to be just a hellscape for them. When I was just starting to teach, there was some book that was out there called, the Girls in the Back Row or something like that. They had us read. It was talking about, students who were in Los Angeles in the school system that, they were Latina and they sat in the back of the room, didn't want to speak, and they went into great detail about the cultural reasons for this and everything else. And I think a lot of it had to do with you don't like feeling like you don't know what's going on and don't understand something. And so you don't want to feel stupid. You don't want to be singled out. So let them make mistakes safely, okay? And like I said earlier, celebrate those. So when a student feels safe, they gain confidence to try. They're going to make mistakes. They're going to go on. And that just leads to hope that they can succeed and become better. So I'm running a little long here, so I'm going to hurry up. So things to focus on with them. This slide right here is just 6 things that we can do. And you've seen these and a lot of other things that you've learned. So find out what they're passionate about, what they want to do. Work with them to set their own goals. In my dissertation process now, I meet with my chair, I meet with her every couple of weeks, but at the beginning of every course in the dissertation, we meet and go over my study plan and what my deadlines are and I'm contributing to that. I own that. That's a powerful thing. Talk to the students about what they want to do and how they're going to get there. Celebrate those achievements, put stuff up on the wall, make them feel like a hero. And remember, slow and easy. Go slow to go fast, little itty bitty chunks of information at a time to mastery. Because once you got that strong foundation in any subject, you can move faster. Like one of the things, this is an unpopular take, but I think our content areas in K-12 public education are too ambitious. When I look at a textbook from 1960, 1970 for physics or chemistry, it was a third or a quarter the length that it is now. We try to go too far and do too much, and we aren't mastering things. I truly believe that college biology professors would rather that their students arrive knowing mitosis, meiosis 1 and 2, and maybe something about the Krebs cycle, and they can go. Whatever those simple things are, they have to memorize and know really well. LX is perfect, a mile wide, inch deep. We need to be a mile deep and maybe more than an inch wide. But we've got to get to where I think that we've done ourselves and our students a disservice. With language, you can't rush it, or they just will never get there. Somebody just posted they translate into genetics and evolution. But Jose, effort, yes. Resilience, and we talked about grit for many years, and some people don't like that term, but this idea that you learn to work your way around obstacles. If a student is taught that they're just not going to succeed in school, they give up too early. And sometimes they don't realize with a lot of the things we teach, especially in high school and middle school, they have to go through a fog to come out on the other side. And we know from research about learning that when they finally get through that aha moment, they learn it better than they could have any other way. It sticks with them. Okay, and they really believe it. Many of us have had that experience where I put it on here. We have to struggle just to be bad at something. You know, when I start out, we're not even qualified as bad. It's just we have nothing to hold on to. And use your own fight with learning to inspire those students. So I went over a little bit. Sorry. Here's my contact information. If you would like to reach out to me, please do. Also, feel free to use the link, and I'll go ahead and put that in the chat real quick so that we can have you do the course evaluation, and you can all judge me. This is the first time I've presented any of this information, so you got to be the guinea pigs, and I only have about half a dozen things I want to do different next time. There's the course evaluation for you in the chat. Again, I really appreciate you being here and taking your time to do this summer. Here's some resources for you that you might want to consider. I'm going to put these links into the chat as well. And even though I'm not seeing everybody's, I'm not seeing everyone's faces today, just with the layout of the screen. It's so good to see some of your names on here. I got a lot of Alvarez and ROP folks here that I've worked with over the years, and it's just really gratifying to see you. I am willing to talk to you at length about this individually. If you want to reach out to me again, if there's anything I can help you with more related to your class. The other person I'm going to refer you to, I don't know if he's here, he signed up, but Tim Amaral, he's another one of my, he's my continuation buddy. He's at El Puente. I recommend his sessions and his information as well. He is truly gifted at this. And one of the things that is really good about Tim spends a lot of time talking about how we as teachers are the most important person in the room to addressing the problem of trauma. It's tough to dial ourselves back and put ourselves beneath the needs of the students, but it really is important for us to think in terms of what we can do to be the best support and the most accessible person for them. Doesn't mean removing all rigor, but it does mean really focusing on the student and where they're at. And you guys are welcome. I see a lot of thank you. It's just super awesome to see everybody, and wish you just a great year this year. Hope and pray it's better than the way last year felt. And I'm looking forward to being there with you in the trenches again. So we will be in touch. I'll stay around if anybody has any questions. I'll go ahead and stop sharing right now. And if anyone has any questions, I'm also going to go ahead and end the recording.